How's it going, everybody? It's Tactard Ted on Tuesday, the 4th of October, 2022. So, what's up for today? Well, it's random thoughts. And yes, it will be random thoughts about the general situation with Ukraine and everything else. I'm going to ramble. I'm going to wander. Maybe that's not a whole lot different than what I normally do, but here we go. So, Ukraine is that crazy bitch abused woman of the world. Let me speak to it. We all know that one particular woman. The one woman who will come out and just make her life of her husband or her boyfriend a living hell. She will bitch, she will raise hell, she will complain, she will do everything to belittle him and even physically abuse him. And she'll do it once, then she'll do it twice. And then she'll do it 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. And because he's a man, and maybe even bigger than she is, maybe not, he won't dare touch her because it would not look good. It'd be a bullying thing, right? Until that one day where he's had enough and he snaps and bam, bip, bap. And she ends up getting thrown through a wall. Now, I'm not advocating violence against women in any way, shape, or form. In fact, if you're in a relationship with that sort of woman, I suggest you leave now. Her vagina is not lined with gold, okay? You might love her, but it isn't worth putting up with the shit. You just, honestly, been there. Dealt with crazy bitches. Got away. So, this is Zelensky. Kept poking Russia. And then Russia puts the smackdown on it. Now, you may say, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, I'm just watching what's currently going on in Ukraine. Apparently, the Ukrainians have figured out, after me pointing it out for months, that they outnumber the Russian forces in Ukraine. This is nothing new. This is not some sort of new cope that I'm trying to give you guys. It's the truth. The Russian forces inside Ukraine have always been numerically inferior to the number of troops that Ukraine has to pull from. And they finally figured that out. And their solution, which I'm not going to bitch about because it's pretty bright. I imagine that NATO, US or the Brits finally said, hey, knuckleheads, you outnumber these guys. And what they've decided to do is negate the way the Russians had been fighting. The Russians were using the same deal they had in Syria. They maintain a line, they pick a point, and they go after it. Now, that means they're strongest at the point they're going after. They tend to be a little weaker where they're holding the line. So, what do the Ukrainians do? Well, they do several offensives right on the heels of each other. Now, interestingly enough, if you listen to a lot of the Ukrainian chatter, the Ukrainian Telegram channels, they will tell you that there is a disagreement, or has been a long-running disagreement with Zelensky and the head general of the Ukrainian army, a guy named Zaluzhny. Zaluzhny was against a offensive in Kherson from the get-go. And wanted to put pressure in Donbass or the north near Kharkov. Zelensky wasn't going to have it. Zelensky was demanding that the offensive had to go in the Kherson region because Kherson was the first major city to fall to the Russians, and he wanted that back. Symbolism. That's the unfortunate thing about this. Zelensky is symbolism over substance. And that's a lot of how this war is being fought, at least on the Ukrainian side, about symbolism over substance. I will tell you right now, tactically, the Russians don't look so good. Strategically, depending on what their strategic goals are, they're doing fine. But tactically, the optics are not very good. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, as I mentioned just a second ago, they're outnumbered. And they've got a bunch of shit going on all over the front. Now, is this a irreversible situation? No, it's not irreversible. In fact, the Russians have already taken steps to change this situation with their mobilization, their call-up of reservists. And we're getting to that point where Ukraine's going to be manhandled. It's going to be smacked through a wall like the crazy bitch. Just, that's the way this works. In the meantime, the crazy bitch is getting her licks in. And it's interesting, back when I was talking about Zaluzhny versus Zelensky, the offensive that has actually gained ground is the one that Zaluzhny was advocating, the one to the north, the one in the north of in the Kharkov region. The one that Zelensky has been just throwing wave after wave after wave is making very, very incremental gains. Not that there's anything wrong with the incremental gains, because I remember I pointed out when the Russians were making incremental gains, and that was a good thing for Russia. Well, it's a good thing for Ukraine that they're making incremental gains. But they're also doing stupid shit. They just put together a force, last couple days, a force of about 3,000 guys. I mentioned this yesterday. They pushed them forward, trying to capture the bridge across the Dnieper. And guess what? I told you we'd be talking about if it made any major gains. No, they pretty much have had to retire, because the Russians keep finding them. And there's all sorts of video out there. You guys want to, you can find it. I know I posted it to my Facebook, with overhead drones just showing tanks huddling up and getting wasted. In fact, I think one of the videos I put on my Facebook is basically, which is Victor Smirnov on Facebook. If you look, it will, the title is, Ukrainian armor column takes a dirt nap. And it shows this long line of tanks and vehicles in Kherson region that has been liquidated. And one of the interesting things about that is when they try to say, well, look what the Russians are doing. Look what the Russians are doing. The Russians have to use this. Lots of buses, lots of civilian vehicles in the Ukrainian column. A lot of civilian vehicles. Now, two things. This tells me that the Ukrainians don't have the infrastructure they need, that their infrastructure has been attrited fairly well. And it also explains why the Ukrainians are opening fire on civilian columns now, because they think if they're doing it, then the Russians must be doing it. Because there was a civilian column in the north part of Donbass trying to escape the advance of the Ukrainian army, and this isn't getting any reportage in the West, and it got lit up by the Ukrainians. Civilian column, civilian vehicles decimated. The Ukrainians have no problem killing civilians. No problem killing civilians. Now, in the old days, we used to call that war crimes. We used to pretend to be against that shit. Now, I guess we just don't report it. We don't go after it. We don't talk about it, because hey, there are people, so we're not going to mention anything they do. And I think that Zelensky and his government are trying to make as many gains as they can right now, which I have a feeling that this is going to be a huge mistake, because they are pushing forward. The autumn rains are starting in Ukraine. The roads and fields will soon turn to mud. Now, tanks, mud, mud, tanks. Those two things don't usually go together too well. In fact, usually what happens when you have a tank in a lot of mud, the tank becomes mired, slipping, stuck, cannot move. We saw this back in the spring. And everybody was saying, oh, the Russians. Well, the Russians had Russian vehicles. And the Soviet-style vehicles have wider tracks. They are made to fight in these conditions. And unfortunately, the Ukrainians now have a lot of Western gear that were not made for the muddy roads. So what's going to happen is a lot of these vehicles that are moving forward, they're not hunkered down in good, safe positions, are going to find themselves mired in mud. Now, when the rains do clear for a day or so, what happens? Well, the mud doesn't simply go away. You simply just don't drive out. You've got to have a couple days, or you have to have a freeze. Now, what happens when the sky clears? Well, what happens when the sky clears is the Russian Air Force, fixed and rotary wing, will fly. And what happens to all those vehicles mired in the mud? They become pretty easy targets. Pretty easy targets indeed. So it's going to be interesting to see if the large supply of man pads that we sent them, see if they actually do have some, or whether they've all ended up on the black market in Europe. Whether there will be enough training or enough of these things to make a difference on the battlefield in Ukraine, if it's going to be able to keep their aircraft off their stock armor. And speaking of armor, now once everything freezes and we get that good solid freeze, armor is going to be able to move with impunity. It's not going to have to worry about getting stuck. It's not going to have to worry about that again until spring. Now, I may mention before, and I will make mention again, that a lot of the reservists who've been called up have been sent to the armor training centers around Russia, and particularly the city of Omsk, which I know well. The two major military installations in Omsk are a tank training center, and there is a VDV, or Russian Airborne Unit, also stationed at Omsk. So it'll be interesting to see what all these new called up tankers are going to be doing. And reports of trains of T-90s being transferred to Ukraine. It's going to be interesting. But as long as these units, these outnumbered units, keep holding ground, they keep pushing the Ukrainians back, they quit, basically slow down the Ukrainian advances, they are going to get their resupply. They are going to get their fresh reserves. They are going to get all this. The Ukrainians aren't. The Ukrainians are at an end of manpower. They're an end of trained personnel. And it's very simple. I mean, you guys can think that this is going to go one way. I honestly don't understand. You guys must really believe that Putin is just a bullshit artist. The only bullshit artist here is Zelensky. Putin's not a bullshit artist. When he tells you he's not bluffing, he's not bluffing. And he is going to send fresh troops into the fray. Fresh troops, fresh equipment. His shit does not have to get flown to Germany or Poland, or driven to Poland, then sneaked across the border, because they don't want Russian missiles to hit it. They're not worried about the Ukrainian missiles hitting the other stuff, and it's going to drive across the border. Also, a lot of folks need to keep their eye on the northern borders of Ukraine, the areas around Belgorod, and the areas of the Belarusian frontier. There's a lot of troops hanging out up there. What are they doing? What are they doing? Can you imagine what they're doing? Well, I can imagine what they're doing. Number one, if they don't just drive directly across the border, they're going to keep a lot of Ukrainians pinned down. In fact, the more aggressive they move along the border, the more the Ukrainians are going to be pinned down. And I would be honest, I would not be at all surprised if there's huge demonstration on the border of Belarus to basically force the Ukrainians into striking Belarus from across the border. Because I will tell you right now, a lot of what the Ukrainians do doesn't make sense. Now, I would imagine that NATO and the U.S. would probably try to tell Zelensky that's not a good idea, but Zelensky is now feeling desperate. You want to talk about desperation. Everybody talks about, oh, the mobilization is a desperation. No. The mobilization is like doing a job if you're a contractor. Simply, you didn't have enough to finish the job. You found out that you didn't have enough materials, you didn't have enough this, you didn't have enough that to complete the job, the task that you had started. So what do? You sit down, you figure, you plan, you calculate, and then you go bring in just exactly what you need to finish the job with. And that's what the mobilization is. It is an attempt to bring in the material and the supplies that you need to finish the job. And that's what that is all about. Zelensky, on the other hand, is grasping at straws. You want to talk about desperation? Desperation was that 11th hour plea for expedited membership in NATO, which within 2 hours, NATO flatly refused. Within 2 hours. Oh, no, that ain't going to happen. No. The best thing we can do for Ukraine is give them weapons, but no, right now is not the time for membership. Wow. So, I don't think it's a far stretch of the imagination for all of us who have been saying for a extended period of time that NATO is willing to fight to the last Ukrainian to harm the Russian Federation. I don't think that that is a conspiracy theory anymore. I would think that that's fairly well established at the moment, that indeed Russia is going to be hit by every Ukrainian until NATO runs out of Ukrainians to throw at them. And Zelensky honestly went out and tried to get in NATO, and NATO flatly refused him. Now, what this does show us is that after Zelensky is thrown under the bus or deposed, that the new Ukrainian government that will exist is going to have closer ties with Russia. Because whoever ends up replacing Zelensky, all they have to do is look at how NATO, the U.S., and everyone else has treated Ukraine. And I've said this from the get-go. I believe that the new Ukraine, if such a thing is allowed to exist, will have closer ties with Russia. I don't believe that they can see a future of doing anything differently. This is proving it to them, that there is no future in hugging NATO. The reliability of having America as your partner. You know, I've discussed that before. It's just not a good deal, because when you're no longer politically expedient, they do jettison you. Russia doesn't seem to have a history of doing that. A hat tip to a friend of mine on Facebook, Larry Spooner. Larry and I had a conversation. He said that, you know, being a younger guy, we only know what we read in history about other wars. And he says it's amazing. He says the level of disinformation and propaganda appears to be at the level they were in World War I. And for those of you who don't recall, there was a lot of propaganda. Now, pictures in the press were not as common as drawings and posters. Those things existed. They existed in World War II. But, you know, there were always the pictures of Germans as being some sort of bestial creature, and they were doing terrible things to French women and French civilians and all all this nastiness, right? And I made the comment that it was very interesting that we've now progressed where we have video on demand, that we have instant news, the 24-hour news cycle. Basically, CNN's on the ground, they report. You get to see what they want you to hear. And it all goes back to another recurring theme that I have espoused more than a few times, is that this only is allowed to exist because we, our country, the United States, or the European Union and big tech, have conspired to silence anything that does not support their narrative. This proves to me that we're the ones at war. This is what we do in a war. This isn't what we do when Israel goes to war. The other side will report from there. We'll let the other side get their word out, but we'll emphasize what Israel wants out. We do the same with other countries. The side that we back is going to have the majority of their stuff reported. The other side will diminish a little bit, but they still get their side out. We are not allowing the Russians to get their side out. We simply aren't. Just the same as we tried not to let the Germans or the Japanese get their side out in a war. Just the same as, it's funny, I think in Vietnam, we probably saw more reporting from North Vietnam than we have from Moscow during this war. And, that's interesting to me. That's interesting. But, so like I said, a lot of random thoughts today. I guess the biggest random thought is the next few weeks we're going to see an interesting change. And I'm sure a lot of people are not going to be ready for it because the realities, everybody thinks that Putin's a bullshit artist, that he's not going to commit large numbers of troops, that he is not going to shut the lights out, that he is not going to attack infrastructure, that people are not going to freeze, that people are still going to be able to charge their cell phones, they're still going to be able to make TikTok videos in Ukraine. I do believe that this is about to get nasty. And that's the funny thing. People, what, nasty? It wasn't nasty. It wasn't as nasty as it could be. This is what's incredible to me. You've got all these Western mercenaries, these guys who've been talked into going over and fighting and dying for Zelensky. They talk about how bad it is. Okay, they're talking about what it's like to be under Russian artillery fire. They're talking what it's like to have fire sweep over. And you see the videos, the guys looking up at the drones, waiting for shit to fall on them, helpless. Don't even have enough training to know, hey, I'm under observation. I need to move. I need to hide. I need to get away. I need to find a hole in the ground. They don't get it. They haven't been trained. They're not able to think it out. They're cannon fodder. But the civilians, for the most part, in a lot of Ukrainian cities, have not had the same suffering. Definitely not the suffering that the people of Donbass have had. Not having water, not having electricity, routinely for 8 years. And I think all that's going to change soon. And I'll be very honestly surprised if it doesn't, because I don't think Putin can hold on to power if he doesn't get a little more ruthless. And I think Putin has a game plan. I think it's all what Putin wants when Putin wants it. But he needs to watch himself, because if he drags his feet too long, the Russian people aren't going to stand for it. They want this over. I know that Putin doesn't have a problem letting the sanctions work their way through Europe. And we already see alliances, the EU starting to crack. We already see NATO starting to crack. It's just a matter of time. This is not going to turn out well. not for the West. Anyhow, folks, you all take care. Bye.